A son's grief turns into a fight for justice after his father's mysterious death. When 13-year-old Jeremiah hugged his father's coffin, he had no idea that the truth behind his father's death would shatter everything he knew about his town and his family. Before we get into this unforgettable story, make sure you're subscribed to Epic Story Moments. Don't forget to hit that bell so you never miss another amazing tale. If you enjoy the story, like, share, and leave a comment. It helps us bring more heartwarming stories your way. And we'd love to know, where are you watching from? Let's stay connected. The rain fell softly, pattering against the canopy of black umbrellas gathered around the gravesite. The funeral procession stood in somber silence as the minister's voice droned on, offering words of comfort that barely pierced the thick, oppressive grief in the air. Jeremiah stood closest to the coffin, his slender hand resting on its polished surface. His other hand gripped the fabric of his suit, a size too big for his small frame. His face was streaked with silent tears, his gaze fixed on the name engraved on the brass plate. David Williams, beloved father, husband, and friend. Beside him, his mother Angela stood stoically, her face an unreadable mask, but her eyes, shadowed and sunken, told a different story, one of a heart shattered into pieces. Clad in a black dress that hugged her trembling frame, she held herself upright, even as grief threatened to topple her. She had to stay strong for her son, for the boy who had just lost his hero. The crowd surrounding them was a mix of mourning friends, distant relatives, and curious onlookers. Whispers flitted like ghosts through the congregation, their tones hushed yet weighted with suspicion. Everyone knew David's death wasn't just an accident. He had been a man of principle, a community leader who challenged injustices that others were too afraid to confront. He had made enemies, powerful ones, and now he was gone. Jeremiah's mind raced as he stared at the coffin. Memories of his father flooded back. The warmth of his laugh, the strength of his embrace, and the way he stood tall in the face of adversity. David had always told him to fight for what's right, even when it's hard. But now, David was gone, and the boy couldn't understand why someone as good as his father would meet such a tragic end. The minister's voice faded as the boy's thoughts consumed him. Out of the corner of his eye, he noticed a figure standing apart from the crowd, Sheriff Hank Lawson, dressed in his uniform. The sheriff's face was somber, his hat held respectfully against his chest. Jeremiah's stomach churned at the sight of him. Hank had always seemed kind, but his mother didn't trust him. She'd warned Jeremiah more than once not to get too close. "He's part of the system," Angela had said, her voice bitter. "The same system that let your father down." Jeremiah wasn't sure what to believe. Sheriff Lawson had always treated his father with respect, but the rumors circling around town told a darker story, one of backdoor deals and selective justice. Could the sheriff have turned a blind eye to the threats against David? Was he complicit, or simply powerless to intervene? The weight of these questions bore down on Jeremiah's young shoulders, blending with the crushing sadness that threatened to overwhelm him. He looked up at his mother, who was staring straight ahead, her lips pressed into a tight line. She had always been his rock, but even she seemed on the verge of breaking. The sound of the coffin being lowered into the ground snapped Jeremiah back to the present. He watched as the casket disappeared, swallowed by the earth. The finality of it hit him like a physical blow, and his knees wobbled. Angela reached out instinctively, placing a hand on his shoulder. "It's okay," she whispered, though her voice trembled. "We'll get through this." As the crowd began to disperse, Jeremiah overheard snippets of conversation that made his blood run cold. "David didn't deserve this," one man muttered. "An accident? Yeah, right," whispered another. "Someone should do something, but nobody will. Not in this town." Jeremiah clenched his fists. The words lingered in his mind, mixing with his own questions and frustrations. Who was responsible for his father's death? Why hadn't anyone stopped it? The ache of loss twisted into something new, a burning need for answers, for justice. As he and Angela walked back to their car, Jeremiah glanced over his shoulder. Sheriff Lawson was still standing by the gravesite, his expression unreadable. For a moment, their eyes met. The sheriff gave a small nod, almost imperceptible, before turning away. Jeremiah couldn't tell if it was meant to be reassuring or dismissive. All he knew was that something about his father's death didn't add up, and no matter how scared he felt, he couldn't let it go. As the last mourners drifted away from the gravesite, Jeremiah stayed behind, lingering by the freshly turned earth. His mother called to him softly, but he didn't move. He wasn't ready to leave, not yet. Somewhere in the crowd, an elderly man with a weathered face and a cane shuffled closer, glancing around as if ensuring no one else was watching. "Your father was a brave man," the man murmured, his voice low and gravelly. "Too brave for his own good in a town like this." Jeremiah turned to look at him, confusion flickering across his tear-streaked face. "What do you mean?" The man leaned in, his voice dropping to a whisper. "It wasn't an accident, boy. Your daddy was stirring up trouble, asking questions he shouldn't have. Some folks didn't like that." Before Jeremiah could ask more, the man straightened, gave him a sharp nod, and walked away, leaving the boy frozen in place. The words replayed in his head, their implications sending a chill down his spine. On the ride home, Jeremiah stared out the window, his mind racing. Angela drove in silence, her hands gripping the wheel tightly. The weight of the day hung between them, unspoken but heavy. Later that evening, while Angela prepared dinner, Jeremiah couldn't hold his thoughts any longer. He leaned against the kitchen counter, his voice hesitant but firm. "Mom, do you think it was an accident? Dad's death, I mean." Angela paused mid-motion, her back to him. For a long moment, she didn't answer. When she finally turned, her eyes were guarded. But there was a flicker of something else, fear. "You shouldn't be asking questions like that," she said, her voice low. "It won't change anything, but—" "Jeremiah," her tone sharpened, cutting him off. "Your father knew the risks. He knew what kind of people he was dealing with." She sighed, rubbing her temples as if the weight of it all was pressing down on her. There were threats. Before he died, Jeremiah's heart sank. "Why didn't you tell me?" "Because I didn't want you involved, and I still don't. Promise me you'll leave it alone." Her eyes bore into his, pleading. "It's not safe." Jeremiah nodded reluctantly, but his mind was already working. If his father had received threats, then someone in town knew what happened, and Jeremiah was determined to find out. The next few days only deepened his resolve. At school, he noticed the whispers and the looks. Some kids avoided him altogether, while others smirked or made snide remarks under their breath. "Guess your dad couldn't keep his nose out of other people's business," one boy muttered as Jeremiah passed by in the hallway. The words stung, but they only fueled his determination. Everywhere he turned, he felt the undercurrent of prejudice and resentment, a stark reminder of the barriers his father had fought against. Late one night, unable to sleep, Jeremiah found himself standing outside his father's study. The door creaked as he pushed it open, the room dark and still. He had rarely been allowed in here. It was his father's sanctuary, filled with books, papers, and the faint smell of old leather. He stepped inside, his eyes scanning the room until they landed on the large wooden desk. The top was cluttered with files and notebooks, but something in the corner caught his eye. A sealed envelope with the words, "If something happens to me," scrawled across it in his father's handwriting. Jeremiah's heart raced as he picked it up. His fingers trembled as he turned it over, his breath quickening. Whatever was inside might hold the answers he was looking for. Just as he began to tear it open, a faint creak echoed through the hallway. He froze, every muscle in his body tensing. Footsteps, slow, deliberate, and getting closer. Jeremiah's eyes darted around the room, searching for a place to hide. The envelope was still clutched in his hand as he moved quickly to the shadows by the bookshelf. The footsteps stopped just outside the door, and for a moment, the only sound was his own pounding heartbeat. The door handle rattled. Jeremiah clutched the envelope tightly as the door creaked open, his heart pounding in his chest. Angela's voice called from the hallway, startling him. "Jeremiah, you're not in bed." Relief washed over him as he stepped out of the shadows. I couldn't sleep," he stammered, hiding the envelope behind his back. Angela's tired eyes softened, but her tone remained firm. "Get some rest, baby. It's been a long day." Nodding quickly, he slipped past her, the envelope still concealed. Back in his room, Jeremiah locked the door, sat on his bed, and opened it. Inside were several folded sheets of paper, a small stack of receipts, and a hand-drawn map marked with red circles. His father's handwriting filled the pages. Notes about land deals, cryptic names, and a name that sent a chill down Jeremiah's spine. Clayton Hargrove. Hargrove was the wealthiest man in town, a landowner with deep ties to local politics. His family had controlled the area for generations, and his reputation was as intimidating as his sprawling estate. Jeremiah couldn't make sense of all the details in the notes, but one thing was clear. David had been investigating something big, and it had everything to do with Hargrove. The map had several locations marked, but one near the edge of town stood out, a remote area deep in the woods. Jeremiah's curiosity burned, but the thought of confronting someone as powerful as Hargrove made his stomach churn. He folded the papers carefully and hid them beneath his mattress before crawling into bed, his mind racing with possibilities. The next morning, Jeremiah woke to find his room in disarray. His drawers were open, clothes scattered on the floor, and his mattress had been shifted. Panic set in as he searched for the envelope, only to find it still tucked safely where he had hidden it. Whoever had been searching hadn't found it. At breakfast, Angela's sharp eyes immediately noticed his distracted demeanor. "What's going on, Jeremiah?" she asked, setting her coffee mug down. "Nothing," he muttered, avoiding her gaze. Angela's voice grew stern. "Don't lie to me." Jeremiah hesitated, then confessed part of the truth. "I found some papers in Dad's study. He was looking into something before he died." Angela's face went pale. She leaned forward, her voice low and urgent. "You need to leave that alone, Jeremiah. I told you it's dangerous. But what if it's connected to what happened to him?" he argued, his frustration spilling out. Tears filled Angela's eyes as she shook her head. "Don't you understand? Whoever did this to your father won't think twice about coming after you. Promise me you'll let it go." Jeremiah couldn't bring himself to make that promise. Instead, he nodded silently, hoping it would ease her worry. Later that day, Jeremiah decided to confide in his best friend, Noah. Noah was one of the few people in town who treated Jeremiah like an equal, despite the subtle tensions that often surrounded their friendship. When Jeremiah showed him the map and the notes, Noah's face grew pale. "My dad works for Hargrove," he said, his voice barely above a whisper. "If he finds out I'm involved—" "I need your help, Noah," Jeremiah pleaded. "I can't do this alone." After a long pause, Noah nodded reluctantly. "Okay, but we have to be careful." That evening, the boys set out on their bikes, following the map to the location deep in the woods. The air grew colder as they pedaled farther from the town, the trees thickening around them. When they reached the marked spot, they found a hidden shack, partially obscured by overgrown bushes and vines. The shack was old and rickety, its windows covered with grime. Jeremiah's pulse quickened as he pushed the door open, the rusty hinges groaning loudly. Inside, the air was musty, and the dim light from their flashlights revealed scattered papers, old tools, and a locked metal box. Jeremiah crouched down and began rummaging through the papers, his hands trembling. Among them, he found photographs, grainy images of people exchanging what looked like money and documents. His flashlight beam landed on one face in the photos, and his breath hitched. It was Clayton Hargrove. "What is this place?" Noah whispered, his voice shaky. Jeremiah didn't answer. His hands moved to the locked box, which had a partially broken latch. With effort, he pried it open, revealing more documents and something that made his blood run cold. a small bag filled with unmarked bullets and a ledger containing detailed payment records. Before Jeremiah could process it, a noise outside made them both freeze. Footsteps, heavy and deliberate. Jeremiah's eyes widened in horror as the door began to creak open. Jeremiah's breath hitched as the door creaked open. He and Noah pressed themselves into the shadows of the shack, their hearts pounding. A figure stepped inside, silhouetted by the dim moonlight filtering through the broken boards. Heavy boots crunched on the wooden floor, and a flashlight beam swept the room. The boys exchanged a silent, panicked look. Slowly, Jeremiah reached for the photographs and documents they had uncovered, stuffing them into his backpack with trembling hands. The figure lingered, muttering to himself as he moved deeper into the shack. Seizing the moment, the boys bolted out the door and into the woods, their feet pounding the ground as they ran. They didn't stop until they reached the edge of the woods, collapsing behind a large tree to catch their breath. Jeremiah clutched his bag tightly, his mind racing with what they had found. Photographs of Hargrove's workers in dangerous conditions, logs of suspicious transactions, and the most damning piece, a threatening letter addressed to David. The letter was brief but chilling. Asterisk, stay out of this, or you won't make it to see your son grow up. Asterisk, when Jeremiah finally got home, Angela was waiting for him. Her arms were crossed, and her expression was a mix of anger and fear. "Where have you been?" she demanded. Jeremiah hesitated, glancing down at his muddy shoes. "Nowhere," he mumbled. But Angela wasn't buying it. "Don't lie to me," she snapped, stepping closer. "What have you done?" When he didn't answer, she grabbed his backpack, unzipping it before he could stop her. Her face went pale as she pulled out the photos, the documents, and the letter. "Jeremiah," she whispered, her voice trembling, "what were you thinking?" "I had to know the truth," he said, his voice breaking. "Dad didn't die in an accident, Mom. Someone killed him." Tears welled up in Angela's eyes, but they were quickly replaced by anger. "And what are you going to do about it? Take on Hargrove yourself? Do you know what he's capable of?" "I can't just do nothing," Jeremiah shot back. "Dad wouldn't have—" Angela's voice softened, but the fear in her eyes remained. "Your father stood up for what he believed in, but it cost him everything. I can't lose you too, Jeremiah." "I'm sorry, Mom," he said, his voice barely above a whisper. "But I have to do this." Angela turned away, her shoulders shaking. She didn't say anything more, and the silence between them was heavier than any argument they'd ever had. That night, Jeremiah lay awake, staring at the ceiling. Guilt gnawed at him. He hated defying his mother, but he couldn't shake the image of his father standing tall, unyielding in the face of injustice. His dad had always told him, asterisk, if you see something wrong, you have to fight to make it right. Asterisk. But now, the weight of that responsibility felt crushing. Jeremiah couldn't help but wonder if he was putting not just himself, but his mother and Noah in danger. What if Hargrove or his men found out what they had discovered? What if they came after the people he loved? The next day, Jeremiah avoided Angela's worried gaze as he left for school. Noah met him outside, his usual carefree demeanor replaced by a nervous energy. "We need to talk," he said in a low voice, pulling Jeremiah aside. "My dad was acting weird last night," Noah continued, glancing around to make sure no one was listening. "He got a phone call, and all I heard him say was, 'I'll take care of it.' Do you think he knows about us?" Jeremiah felt a chill run down his spine. "I don't know," he admitted, "but we have to be careful. This is bigger than we thought." That afternoon, Jeremiah sat alone in his room, spreading the evidence across his bed. He studied the photographs, the logs, and the map, searching for a connection. The pieces were starting to come together. Hargrove's illegal dealings weren't just about money. They were about control. David had tried to expose him, and now Jeremiah was walking the same dangerous path. But as much as the fear lingered, so did the fire of determination. Jeremiah couldn't let his father's fight end in silence. He couldn't let Hargrove win. He folded the documents carefully and hid them under a loose floorboard in his room. As he pressed the board back into place, he thought about the look on his mother's face when she had found the evidence. She was terrified for him, and he couldn't blame her. But he also couldn't stop. The memory of his father's voice echoed in his mind. Asterisk, be brave, Jeremiah, even when it's hard. Asterisk. And so, with fear and resolve battling inside him, Jeremiah prepared for what came next. A few days after their harrowing discovery in the shack, Jeremiah was startled to find Sheriff Hank Lawson waiting for him outside the school gates. The sheriff tipped his hat as Jeremiah approached, his expression unreadable. "Got a minute, son?" Hank asked. Jeremiah hesitated but nodded. He followed Hank to his patrol car, where the sheriff leaned against the hood, his weathered face tense. "I've been meaning to talk to you," Hank began, his voice low. "Your father and I, we weren't exactly friends, but we saw eye to eye on some things. He told me about the trouble he was stirring up before he passed." Jeremiah's chest tightened. "Why didn't you help him?" Hank sighed, pulling off his hat and running a hand through his thinning hair. "You think I didn't want to? You think I don't want justice for David? But this town doesn't run on what's right, Jeremiah. It runs on power. And Hargrove's got more of it than I'll ever have. So, what? You just let him get away with it." The sheriff's jaw tightened, and for a moment, a flicker of shame crossed his face. "Sometimes, you've got to pick your battles, boy. I've been trying to gather enough evidence to make something stick, but every time I get close, it disappears. People change their stories. Files go missing. It's like trying to fight smoke." Jeremiah's eyes narrowed. "You're scared of him. I'm scared of what happens to people who go up against him," Hank admitted. "But I'm not here to lecture you. I just want you to be careful. Whatever you think you've got on Hargrove, it's dangerous. And he won't think twice about coming after a kid." Jeremiah didn't respond. He simply turned and walked away, his fists clenched. Hank's warning only fueled his frustration. The people who were supposed to protect his family had failed, and now it was up to him to make things right. Later that evening, Jeremiah met Noah behind the old playground where they used to hang out as kids. The tension in Noah's face was impossible to ignore. "My dad's been acting strange," Noah said, his voice shaky. "He's been having these secret phone calls, and I heard him talking about witnesses." "What did he say?" Jeremiah pressed. Noah glanced around nervously, lowering his voice. "I think Hargrove paid people off after your dad died. There's this rumor going around that someone saw what happened, but got quiet real quick after Hargrove's people visited them." Jeremiah's stomach churned. "Do you know who it was?" Noah shook his head. "No. But if my dad finds out I'm helping you, it's over for me, Jeremiah. He won't even let me leave the house." "I get it," Jeremiah said, placing a hand on Noah's shoulder. "If you need to back out, I understand." Noah hesitated before shaking his head. "No, I'm in this with you. Just let's be smart about it, okay?" When Jeremiah got home that night, Angela was waiting for him in the living room. She was holding an old photo album, her expression soft but weary. "Sit down, Jeremiah," she said, curious but wary. He sat beside her on the couch. Angela opened the album, revealing photos of her and David from years ago. In one picture, they were standing together at a rally, holding signs that read "Justice for All." "This was the day I knew I loved your father," Angela said, her voice tinged with sadness. "He had this fire in him, this belief that no matter how hard things got, we could make the world better if we just kept fighting." She turned the page to another photo, this one of David holding a newborn Jeremiah. "When you were born, he said you were the best thing we'd ever done. He wanted so much for you, Jeremiah. A better life, a safer world." Tears welled up in her eyes as she closed the album. "That's why I'm so scared for you. I lost him because he wouldn't back down. And I can't lose you too." Jeremiah felt a lump in his throat. "Mom, I'm doing this for him. For us. I can't just let what happened to Dad go unanswered." Angela placed a hand on his cheek, her touch warm but trembling. "Just promise me you'll be careful, that you'll think about what's worth risking and what's not." Jeremiah nodded, though deep down, he knew there was no turning back. As Angela walked away, he looked down at the photo album, his resolve hardening. His father had fought for justice, and now it was his turn. Jeremiah and Noah sat in the dimly lit corner of an old diner, the envelope of evidence resting between them on the sticky table. They had spent days debating what to do with it, finally deciding to anonymously send it to a journalist known for exposing corruption. Noah was jittery, his knee bouncing under the table. "This has to work," Noah said, his voice barely above a whisper. "It will," Jeremiah assured him, though his confidence wavered. "Once they see what we've got, they'll have no choice but to investigate." The boys left the diner and made their way to the agreed-upon drop-off point, an abandoned post office on the edge of town. Jeremiah slipped the envelope into a battered mailbox, their contact set to retrieve it within the hour. But as they walked away, headlights appeared in the distance, piercing the darkness. The rumble of an engine grew louder, and a black SUV began following them. "Don't look back," Jeremiah hissed, quickening his pace. Noah's voice trembled. "What do we do?" "Stay calm," Jeremiah said, though his own heart was pounding. "We'll cut through the alley." The boys darted into a narrow alley, but the SUV skidded to a stop and two men stepped out, their faces obscured by shadows. Jeremiah and Noah sprinted toward the other end of the alley, their breaths ragged. They didn't stop running until they reached a crowded street, blending into the throng of people. By the time they got to Noah's house, they were both shaking. "They knew," Noah said, pacing the room. "They knew about the envelope." "How did they know?" Jeremiah didn't answer. His mind raced, piecing together fragments of recent events. Someone had tipped them off, but who? The next morning, Jeremiah sat alone in his room, staring at the photos and documents still hidden under the floorboard. The envelope had been a decoy, but the men who followed them didn't know that. Yet someone close to them had betrayed their plan. Jeremiah's thoughts turned to Hank. The sheriff had warned him about the dangers of going after Hargrove. Could he have been trying to protect him, or was he playing both sides? And then there was Noah's father, who worked directly for Hargrove. Had he overheard something? Jeremiah's stomach churned with suspicion. He decided to confront Hank, but as he approached the sheriff's office, he stopped in his tracks. Through the window, he saw Hank in heated conversation with a man in a suit, one of Hargrove's top associates. Hank's expression was hard to read, but the sight of him shaking the man's hand sent a wave of betrayal crashing over Jeremiah. He turned and walked away, his chest tight with anger and confusion. When he got home, his heart sank. The front door was ajar, and the house was eerily silent. He stepped inside, his eyes scanning the living room. Furniture was overturned, picture frames shattered on the floor. "Mom," he called out, panic rising. Angela appeared from the kitchen, her face pale and drawn. "Jeremiah," she began, her voice trembling. He followed her gaze to the wall, where a message was scrawled in red spray paint. "Drop it, or you're next." Jeremiah's legs felt weak, and he leaned against the doorway to steady himself. Angela grabbed his arm, her grip firm despite her shaking hands. "This has to stop, Jeremiah," she pleaded. "They're serious." Jeremiah stared at the message, his heart pounding in his chest. The fight had just gotten personal, and the stakes had never been higher. The spray-painted threat lingered in Jeremiah's mind like a dark cloud, but instead of deterring him, it solidified his resolve. He spent the next day poring over the documents hidden under his floorboard, looking for something, anything, that could give him a new lead. That's when he found it. A name he hadn't noticed before, scribbled on the corner of a receipt. William Carter. Jeremiah didn't recognize the name, but the receipt was tied to one of Hargrove's companies. He decided to dig deeper, sneaking off to the local library to use the public computer. After hours of searching, he unearthed a connection. William Carter was a mid-level manager in Hargrove's construction business. He had abruptly left the company 6 months ago, around the time David started his investigation. With a mix of nerves and determination, Jeremiah tracked Carter to a rundown motel on the outskirts of town. The man who opened the door looked worn down, his eyes sunken and his hair unkempt. He flinched when Jeremiah introduced himself. "I don't know what you're talking about," Carter said, trying to shut the door. "Please," Jeremiah begged, wedging his foot in the doorway. "My dad was David Freeman. He was trying to expose Hargrove, and now he's gone. I think you know why." Carter froze, his eyes darting around the parking lot before pulling Jeremiah inside. "You shouldn't be here," he hissed. "I don't have a choice," Jeremiah replied. "You know something? I can see it in your face." Carter sighed, slumping onto the edge of the bed. "Your dad. He was the only one brave enough to stand up to Hargrove. I tried to help him, but when I got caught, I ran. I'm sorry, kid. I should have done more." Jeremiah placed the receipt on the table. "You can still do something. Testify. Go public." Carter's laugh was hollow. "You don't get it, do you? Hargrove owns this town. The cops, the judges, they're all in his pocket. You think anyone's going to listen to me?" Before Jeremiah could respond, there was a knock at the door. Carter's face turned pale, and he motioned for Jeremiah to hide. Peeking through the curtain, Jeremiah saw a familiar figure standing outside, Angela. When Carter opened the door, Angela pushed past him, her eyes blazing. "Jeremiah, get out here. Now." Caught. Jeremiah stepped out from behind the curtain. "Mom, You think I wouldn't notice you sneaking out again," she snapped. "You're lucky I followed you." Angela turned to Carter, her expression softening. "I know you're scared, Mr. Carter. Believe me, I understand. But running won't make this go away. My husband didn't die for nothing, and I won't let his legacy end here." Carter looked between Angela and Jeremiah, his shoulders slumping. "Even if I wanted to help, Hargrove would kill me before I got the chance." "Not if we expose him first," Angela said firmly. "You're not alone anymore. We can do this together." Carter hesitated before nodding, his fear giving way to a glimmer of hope. "There's something you need to know," he said. "Hargrove's been paying off the cops for years. Hank Lawson, he's on the payroll. So are half the deputies in town." Jeremiah's stomach dropped. "Hank's been lying this whole time." Carter nodded. "He plays the good guy, but he's as dirty as the rest of them." Angela's jaw tightened. "Then we'll start with him. If we can take down Hargrove's enforcers, the rest will follow." Jeremiah looked at his mother with newfound respect. For the first time, he saw her not just as someone trying to protect him, but as someone ready to fight. That night, as they left Carter's motel room, Jeremiah felt a renewed sense of purpose. With Angela by his side and a new ally willing to testify, they were closer than ever to exposing the truth. But he couldn't shake the feeling that the fight was far from over, and that the real danger had only just begun. Jeremiah's resolve hardened after Carter's confession, and as they walked away from the motel, he felt a surge of responsibility wash over him. For the first time since his father's death, he wasn't just a boy searching for answers. He was a leader. The weight of that realization wasn't lost on him, but it fueled something inside him that he hadn't known he had. He wasn't alone anymore. Angela had joined the fight. Carter had offered his help, and now it was time to gather the community. Jeremiah reached out to those who had known and respected his father, hoping to form a coalition of people who still believed in justice, in truth. The next few days were spent meeting in secret with old friends of David, people who had been too afraid to speak up after his death. The group grew steadily, a mix of the town's residents, Black, white, and Latino, who had all been affected by Hargrove's reign of terror in different ways. Some were victims of Hargrove's shady dealings. Others were friends of David who had witnessed his efforts to expose corruption, and a few had simply grown tired of the fear that gripped their town. Jeremiah spoke to them with a confidence he hadn't known he had, urging them to stand up. "We can't keep letting them control us," he said, his voice shaking with passion. "We've got to take back our town. Take back the truth. My father died for it. We owe it to him to finish what he started." As the group grew, the members took on different roles, some gathering evidence, others planning the next steps, and a few using their resources to contact journalists from outside the corrupt network. Jeremiah worked closely with Carter to verify every piece of evidence, while Angela began arranging for the media to receive the data anonymously. It wasn't enough to trust local authorities anymore. They needed to bypass the system completely. They devised a plan to leak the evidence directly to the media, ensuring it reached the public eye without interference. The strategy was risky, but they knew it was their only option. Angela, once a bystander in her husband's crusade, now took on the mantle of leadership beside her son. The day the plan was set in motion, tension hung thick in the air. Jeremiah and Angela watched as the group worked in unison, spreading out across the town to execute their plan. The envelope, now packed with documents, photographs, and the damning testimony from Carter, was entrusted to a trusted ally who would deliver it to an independent news outlet in a neighboring city. The town would have to wait for the truth to hit the headlines. But as the minutes ticked by, an ominous feeling settled in. Jeremiah knew that Hargrove wouldn't take this lying down. The retaliatory strike came swiftly. By evening, the first of the targeted attacks occurred. A prominent figure in the movement, Edgar, an older black man who had been a close friend of David, was found badly beaten in his own home. A warning scrawled across his living room wall in black paint read, "You think you can take us down? Think again." The group was shaken but not deterred. Edgar, though bruised and battered, had refused to break. He swore to continue the fight and encouraged the group to stay focused. However, his attack set a dangerous precedent. Hargrove wasn't just trying to stop the movement. He was sending a clear message. No one was safe. Jeremiah knew that the next phase of their plan would only escalate the danger. As the group continued to gather evidence, more of their numbers were targeted. The media leak was imminent, and they could only hope the evidence would reach the public before Hargrove's forces could stamp it out. The town was growing restless. Fear and anger began to boil over. People had been living under Hargrove's thumb for too long, and now, with the truth beginning to unravel, the weight of their oppression seemed unbearable. Rumors of a possible protest circulated, and tensions were high as more residents, both black and white, decided to take to the streets, demanding justice. The power of the community was undeniable, but so was the wrath of Hargrove. Jeremiah had always felt like an outsider in his own town, but now he felt the collective strength of his father's legacy, a strength he had inherited. The day of reckoning was coming. Jeremiah could feel it in the pit of his stomach. The evidence would go public soon, and it would change everything. But with every passing hour, the stakes grew higher. The fight for justice had become a battle for survival, and Jeremiah knew that no one would be untouched by the chaos that was about to unfold. The day of the protest arrived with an undercurrent of anticipation, the weight of it pressing down on the small southern town like a thunderstorm. Jeremiah and Angela had organized a peaceful demonstration, one that would bring together every person who had suffered under Hargrove's rule, from those whose land had been stolen to those who had lived in fear of his influence. Word had spread, and the protest was gaining traction far beyond what they had hoped. People were traveling from surrounding towns to join the fight for justice. The local press, now convinced that the movement was a genuine call for change, had started covering it extensively, amplifying the stakes. Jeremiah stood at the front of the gathering, his heart pounding. He had never felt more alive, nor more vulnerable. Behind him, Angela spoke to the crowd, her voice unwavering. She had become a symbol of resilience, and with each word, she stoked the flames of hope in the people who gathered. They were there for David, for Edgar, for every person who had suffered at the hands of Hargrove and his cronies. As the protest swelled, the mood shifted from hopeful unity to raw tension. People were chanting, waving signs, and marching together toward the heart of town, where Hargrove's office and estate stood like a looming fortress. The police had been called in, and their presence was heavy, but for now, they maintained their distance, wary of provoking the crowd. But the shadow of Hargrove's men was never far behind. Jeremiah knew the standoff would come. Hargrove wouldn't let this go unanswered. And soon, a convoy of black SUVs rolled into town, filled with Hargrove's hired enforcers. As they began to position themselves at the edge of the crowd, Jeremiah felt a chill run down his spine. "Stay close," Angela whispered to him, her hand firm on his shoulder. "We don't know what they'll do." The air crackled with unease. The protesters, though peaceful, were charged with an intensity that felt like a breaking point. As more Hargrove men moved into position, a line was drawn between the two sides, between justice and oppression. Tensions were at a boiling point, and it was clear that something would snap. Then it happened. A young protester, fueled by anger and adrenaline, crossed the line. A single shove sent him into the path of one of Hargrove's men, and that was all it took. The enforcers surged forward, grabbing protesters by the arm, shoving them to the ground. Chaos erupted. Jeremiah's heart raced as his mother pushed him back into the crowd, trying to protect him from the violence that was quickly spiraling out of control. He stumbled, but before he could regain his footing, he was caught in a brutal grip. One of Hargrove's men had grabbed him by the collar, lifting him off the ground. His breath caught in his throat. For a moment, the world seemed to freeze. He was face to face with a man who was clearly prepared to hurt him, to silence him. "Let him go," Angela shouted, shoving her way through the crowd. But the enforcer didn't release his grip on Jeremiah, tightening it instead, his eyes burning with rage. Just as the situation seemed to reach its breaking point, a figure stepped forward, someone no one had expected. Sheriff Hank Lawson. Jeremiah's eyes widened in disbelief as Hank shoved through the chaos, his badge glinting in the sun. For a moment, it seemed like a mirage. Hank had been a part of the system that Jeremiah had come to despise, yet here he was, standing against the men he had once protected. "Let the boy go." Hank's voice rang out, firm and commanding. The enforcer hesitated, caught off guard by the sheriff's sudden authority. Hank didn't flinch. His eyes locked onto the man's with an intensity that surprised everyone around him. The enforcer finally released Jeremiah, stepping back with a muttered curse. Jeremiah, gasping for breath, staggered to his feet, his heart still racing in his chest. "Are you okay?" Hank asked quietly, his voice low, as he kept his eyes on the men who were still circling the protest. Jeremiah nodded, his mind whirling. He couldn't believe what had just happened. Had Hank actually saved him? The same man who had always seemed indifferent, who had let Hargrove's power fester in the shadows, had now acted. Something had finally shifted within him. "You don't belong with them," Hank said, his gaze hardening as he turned to the enforcers. "Get out of here, or I'll have you arrested for assaulting a minor." There was a tense moment of silence. Then, one by one, Hargrove's men began to retreat, knowing they couldn't risk an all-out confrontation in front of so many witnesses. The crowd, watching in stunned silence, began to cheer, their voices swelling in a wave of triumph. The tension didn't ease, though. It only intensified. As Hank left the scene, the protesters knew that the danger wasn't over. Hargrove would fight back, but this was their moment. As the day wore on, the media finally began to broadcast the footage of the protest, the confrontation, and the revelation of Hargrove's corruption. The evidence they had leaked, coupled with Hank's unexpected defection, made the news cycle, forcing Hargrove's empire to crack under the pressure. Jeremiah stood tall beside his mother, watching as the town that had once seemed so divided now united in their struggle for justice. But he knew that this was just the beginning. Hargrove's downfall was inevitable, but the fight was far from over. The truth had been exposed, and there was no turning back. The news of Hargrove's arrest spread like wildfire across town, from the poorest neighborhoods to the richest estates. The announcement brought a wave of relief and disbelief. The man who had controlled the town, who had twisted it to his will through fear and manipulation, was finally behind bars. It was a victory, not just for Jeremiah and Angela, but for the entire community. The release of the evidence had been the tipping point. Every secret Hargrove had fought to keep buried now saw the light of day. Whistleblowers had come forward, and the testimonies had been damning. Hargrove was arrested, his empire of corruption crumbling before the eyes of the town he had once ruled with an iron fist. Jeremiah stood outside the courthouse, surrounded by a small crowd of supporters. His heart was full, but there was a heaviness to it. His father's fight had been completed, but it had come at a cost. So many people had suffered, and while the arrest was a victory, the scars left by Hargrove's reign would take time to heal. Angela was by his side, her eyes glistening with tears of pride. "We did it," she whispered, squeezing his hand. "Your father would have been proud," as the crowd cheered. Their joy reverberated through the streets, but Jeremiah couldn't shake the feeling that their victory was only part of a larger battle. There was still work to be done. Hargrove may have been defeated, but the system he built needed to be torn down, brick by brick. In the days that followed, the town began to heal. People who had been too afraid to speak out for so long found their voices. Local leaders who had been complicit in Hargrove's actions were called to account, and new leadership began to rise from the ashes of the old order. Slowly, the town began to shift, moving toward a future that David had dreamed of, a future where justice wasn't just a word but a reality for everyone. But the most unexpected moment came when Hank Lawson, the sheriff who had once stood as an obstacle in their path, walked into the center of town. The man who had once remained silent in the face of corruption now stood ready to answer for his own failures. Jeremiah had heard the rumors, but seeing Hank in person, standing there with a solemn expression, hit him harder than he expected. The sheriff approached him, his eyes filled with regret. "I need to say something," Hank began, his voice low. "I've spent my whole life trying to convince myself I was doing the right thing. I thought I was protecting people, but I was protecting the wrong ones. Your father was a good man. He fought for something real, and I was too weak to help him. I failed him, and I failed you." Jeremiah met Hank's gaze, his emotions conflicted. Part of him still felt the sting of the sheriff's inaction, but there was a flicker of something else, recognition. Hank hadn't remained silent forever. Now, he was taking responsibility for his actions, something many in the town had never done. "I don't know if you can forgive me," Hank continued, "but I'm going to spend the rest of my life trying to make it right. I'm going to help rebuild this town, and I'll make sure that what happened to your father never happens again." Jeremiah studied him for a long moment, and then slowly he nodded. "I don't know if I can forgive you either, Hank, but I think you're on the right path now. It's a start." The air felt different in that moment, as if the weight of years of injustice had begun to lift. Hank's confession didn't erase the pain or the loss, but it did mark the beginning of a new chapter. The town rallied together in the days that followed, with new leaders taking the reins and old systems being dismantled. The courthouse became a symbol of change, and for the first time in a long while, the people of the town could walk the streets without fear. The healing process had begun. For Jeremiah, the battle was far from over, but as he stood beside his mother, watching the community unite, he realized that his father's legacy had lived on. Through the movement, through the people who had fought for justice, and through the change that was now taking place. The truth had been exposed, and justice had been served. It wasn't the end of the journey, but it was a powerful beginning. In the aftermath of Hargrove's arrest, as the town slowly found its footing again, Jeremiah began to reflect on the journey that had led them here. The triumph of justice had been hard-earned, but it had come with emotional costs that were only beginning to settle in his heart. Jeremiah had faced the sting of betrayal from those he once trusted. People close to him, his friends, the sheriff, and even his community, had turned a blind eye or had played a part in the very injustices his father had fought against. He had spent so much time angry at the system, at the people who had allowed this evil to thrive, that he hadn't allowed himself to feel compassion for them until now. But as the dust settled and the town began to rebuild, Jeremiah saw something he hadn't expected. The faces of people who had once stood silent now apologizing, now standing up for what was right. Hank's confession had been a turning point, not just for him, but for everyone in the town who had witnessed his change. Jeremiah realized that forgiveness wasn't about forgetting the past or excusing the hurt. It was about understanding that everyone carried their own burdens, their own fears. Even those who had failed him could find redemption. When Hank had spoken, his voice filled with genuine remorse. Jeremiah had felt the weight of his own anger begin to lift. It wasn't easy to forgive, and it wasn't something that happened overnight. But Jeremiah understood now that forgiveness didn't have to mean absolving the person of their wrongdoings. It meant acknowledging the pain, but choosing not to carry it anymore. Choosing to heal, even when the world around you wasn't perfect. The story of his father's legacy, the courage and fight for justice that had transcended even death, had left Jeremiah with a new understanding of power. David had taught him that standing up against injustice, no matter the cost, was an act of strength. And now, he realized that the real power lay not in the pursuit of vengeance, but in the willingness to move forward, to rise above the hate, and to find common ground even with those who had once opposed him. The power of unity had also become clear to him. The people of the town, once divided by fear and hate, had found solidarity in the pursuit of justice. They had come together as a community, and in doing so, they had proven that collective strength could dismantle even the most deeply rooted systems of oppression. They had learned that change wasn't just possible. It was inevitable when people chose to stand up together, hand in hand. Jeremiah could see the legacy of courage and unity unfolding before him in the faces of those who had gathered for the protest, in the survivors of Hargrove's manipulation, and in the very streets of the town that were now being restored. His father's fight had sparked a movement, but it was the courage of every individual who had chosen to stand by that truth that had turned it into something unstoppable. Jeremiah's journey had brought him face to face with the harsh realities of the world, but it had also shown him the transformative power of love, compassion, and solidarity. He learned that standing up for what is right isn't just about the battle. It's about what you do afterward. It's about what kind of world you want to build. And Jeremiah understood now that the most powerful way to honor his father's legacy was to keep fighting, not with anger or vengeance, but with courage, compassion, and a firm belief that every person had the ability to change, even in the face of their darkest deeds. As the community rebuilt, one brick at a time, and as new leaders rose from the ashes of Hargrove's empire, Jeremiah stood at the forefront, not as a boy seeking revenge, but as a young man committed to justice. His journey wasn't over. There were still battles to be fought, but he now understood that the true power lay not in the fight itself, but in the unity and compassion that could bind people together to create lasting change. In the end, the lesson was clear. Injustice could be defeated not just by standing up to it, but by standing together, by lifting each other up, forgiving past wrongs, and embracing the courage to move forward united. Jeremiah stood at the front of a small crowd gathered at the memorial for his father. The sky overhead was clear, the first light of morning casting long shadows over the town cemetery. The air was heavy with emotion, yet there was a sense of peace settling over the crowd. His mother, Angela, stood beside him, her hand resting gently on his shoulder, her eyes filled with quiet pride. This moment, this final act, felt like both an ending and a beginning. The years of pain, the fight for justice, and the many sacrifices had led to this point. His father's legacy had not been in vain, and now it was Jeremiah's turn to carry it forward. He cleared his throat, his voice steady but filled with the weight of everything he had learned. The crowd had been with him through every twist and turn, every difficult decision. And now, it was time to speak the words that would mark the next chapter of his life. "I'm here today because of my father," he began, his voice breaking slightly but never faltering. "He taught me that courage isn't about fighting with fists or anger. It's about standing firm, even when the world is against you. It's about knowing what's right and never, ever backing down. My father didn't just fight for justice. He lived for it, and I will do the same." Jeremiah paused for a moment, his eyes scanning the faces of the people who had come to honor his father's memory. There was a deep silence in the air, a stillness that spoke volumes. He could feel the weight of the town's collective grief, but also its collective hope. My dad believed in a world where fairness and kindness were more than just words. He believed that everyone, no matter who they were or where they came from, deserved the chance to live free from fear and hatred. I can't bring him back, but I can continue his fight. I can make sure that his vision for a better world doesn't end with his death. Jeremiah looked toward his mother, who smiled softly, her eyes glistening with pride. It wasn't the kind of smile that came easily. It was a smile earned through years of hardship and sacrifice. But it was a smile that reflected the strength of a mother who had fought beside her husband and now stood alongside her son, watching him become the man his father had hoped he would be. Angela's heart swelled with pride as she listened to Jeremiah. She had watched him grow from a boy unsure of himself into a young man who had found his purpose. Her husband, David, would have been proud. She had feared that her son would fall into the same trap of bitterness and anger that so many before him had. But instead, Jeremiah had chosen a different path. He had chosen to lead with his heart, to fight not out of hatred, but out of a deep, abiding love for what was right. After Jeremiah finished speaking, there was a quiet murmur of agreement from the crowd. A few people wiped away tears. Others stood in silent contemplation. The moment was sacred, the weight of the past and the promise of the future hanging in the air. Later, when the crowd had begun to disperse, Jeremiah stood alone at his father's grave. He placed a single flower on the stone, its bright petals contrasting with the dark, weathered surface. His fingers lingered on the edge of the grave, and for a moment he closed his eyes. His father's death had shaken him to his core, but it had also shaped him into someone capable of carrying forward the lessons David had left behind. There was a sense of peace in his heart now, an understanding that the fight for justice wasn't something that ended when a battle was won. It was something that would last a lifetime. As he stood there, looking out over the horizon, Jeremiah felt a renewed sense of hope. The world had been through so much, and there was still much work to be done. But he was no longer the boy who had been crushed under the weight of his father's death. He was the young man who had found his own voice, his own sense of purpose. "Thank you, Dad," he whispered to the wind, as if his father could hear him. "I'll carry on. I'll make sure your fight continues." Jeremiah took a deep breath, straightened his shoulders, and turned away from the grave. His heart was full, but there was no sadness in it, only hope, only the belief that, no matter how dark things seemed, justice would always find a way. And with that, he walked into the future, a future that was now full of possibility, full of purpose, a future where his father's legacy would live on, not just in memory, but in the ongoing fight for justice, fairness, and the belief that a better world was always worth striving for.